Awakening doesn't feel like clarity, it feels like confusion. There's no dramatic music, no sudden burst of light, just a strange, quiet stillness. You don't feel like you've gained something, you just sense that something has ended. Not a loud collapse, not a major breakdown, just a feeling that's hard to explain. Something ended, but nothing replaced it. You begin to notice more, you see more clearly. And the things that once pushed you forward, ambition, goals, roles, labels, suddenly feel lighter than they used to. The motivations that once carried you through each day feel like habits you're still performing, but no longer fully believe in. You don't feel the same pull towards social roles. You're less interested in proving who you are. And quietly, almost without realizing it, you begin to question a story you never thought to question before. That success automatically leads to happiness. But instead of freedom, what shows up is disorientation. You're not broken. You're not losing your mind. It's just that awareness breaks the map. Once you start seeing more clearly, your beliefs, your direction, the path you were told to follow, stops working. And the unsettling part is this: no one tells you where to go after the map disappears. Alan Watts once pointed to something simple but profound. When the old story ends, the new one hasn't formed yet. And it's right here, in this quiet, confusing space, that this journey truly begins. You didn't lose yourself. The version of you that survived expired. For a long time, you knew who you were, not because you had deeply questioned it, but because life gave you a role, a career to grow into, a relationship to maintain, an ambition to chase, a belief system that told you what mattered. These things didn't just organize your life, they organized your identity. You were productive, responsible, motivated, because that version of you had a job to do. Survive, succeed, belong. But when awareness deepens, something subtle happens. You start to see the script. You notice how many of your choices weren't really choices at all, but expectations you absorbed, paths you inherited, stories you stepped into without ever asking if they were truly yours. And once you see that, the old story begins to collapse. This is where many people get scared. Because from the outside, nothing looks wrong. You might be successful, respected, even admired. And yet inside there's a strange emptiness. You did everything you were supposed to do, and it didn't give you what it promised. Or maybe you did the opposite. You quit the job, you stepped away from the identity, and suddenly, without the title, the routine, the structure, you don't know who you are anymore. This is incredibly common, especially in modern American culture where identity is so tightly fused with productivity. We are taught to answer the question, who are you? With what we do. So when awareness dissolves that attachment, it can feel like an internal failure. A lot of people assume something is wrong with me. Why can't I go back to how I was? Why does nothing motivate me anymore? But here's a more accurate way to see it. The old operating system can't run this level of awareness. The identity that once kept you moving was built for a different phase of life. It worked until it didn't. This isn't a breakdown. It's not a mistake. Losing direction here doesn't mean you're failing. It means the old story no longer fits the truth you're seeing. And that's uncomfortable, because endings are clear, but beginnings are quiet. When a story collapses, it leaves behind space. And space feels like confusion until something more honest starts to form. In the next part, we're going to talk about why awareness rarely gives you clarity right away, and why feeling lost after waking up is not a sign that you've gone backward, but a sign that you've stepped into unfamiliar territory. Because once the map disappears, the real journey begins, even if you don't recognize it yet. Awareness doesn't tell you where to go. It only shows you where you can't go back to. One of the biggest myths in modern self-help culture is the idea that awareness immediately brings alignment. That once you see clearly, everything in your life will fall into place. Your purpose, your direction, your confidence. But that's not how awareness actually works. Awareness doesn't arrive as a blueprint. It arrives as a disruption. Its first function isn't to build a new life. It's to dismantle the one that was built on assumptions. That's why the early phase feels so unsettling. You don't suddenly feel inspired. You don't feel activated. You feel stripped down. A useful way to think about this is like updating an operating system. The system becomes more advanced, more capable, more precise. But the old apps, the habits, motivations, identities that used to run everything, are no longer compatible. They disappear. So yes, you're more aware, you're more honest, you're less unconscious, but you're also empty. And the mind hates emptiness. It wants direction, it wants meaning, it wants to know, who am I now? From a fractal wisdom perspective, this is not a malfunction. Loss of identity is a necessary chaos phase. Not chaos as destruction, but chaos as transition. It's the in-between state where the old structure has dissolved, but the new one hasn't emerged yet. The problem is that most people don't know how to stay here, so they rush to replace the old story. They adopt a new spiritual identity, a new belief system, a new label that sounds meaningful. They declare a purpose before anything real has had time to grow. Not because it's true, but because the feeling of not knowing who you are is deeply uncomfortable. So the mind grabs onto something, anything, to restore a sense of certainty. But clarity that arrives too fast is often just another escape. Real direction doesn't come from deciding who you should become next. It comes from staying present long enough for something authentic to take shape. This phase feels disorienting because you're no longer guided by fear, habit, or expectation, but you're not yet guided by truth either. You're learning how to exist without a script. And that takes time. In the next part, we'll explore why this in-between state feels so chaotic emotionally, and why what looks like instability on the surface is often the nervous system reorganizing itself at a deeper level. Because once awareness removes direction, it doesn't leave you empty by accident. It creates the space where something real can finally emerge. Chaos isn't punishment. It's what happens when truth removes structure. After awareness takes away direction, chaos usually follows. Not loud chaos, not dramatic breakdowns, but a quiet unraveling. You might notice yourself speaking less. You're no longer driven by the same urgency. The constant push to hustle, optimize, or perform just fades. You don't feel the same hunger to prove anything to anyone. And that can be frightening, because from the outside, this looks like stagnation. It looks like you're falling behind, like you're losing momentum. So the mind jumps to conclusions. Am I depressed? Am I becoming lazy? Did I break something inside myself? But this isn't depression, and it's not apathy. What's happening is much deeper. Your nervous system is reorganizing. For years, maybe decades, your system was oriented around survival patterns, achievement, validation, control, distraction. Awareness disrupts those patterns, and when that happens, the body doesn't rush forward, it slows down. That's why you might lose interest in small talk, why scrolling social media suddenly feels exhausting, why being around constant noise or stimulation feels draining instead of exciting. You might crave solitude, not because you hate people, but because your system needs space. And at the same time, that solitude can feel unsettling, because when you're alone long enough, there's no role to play, no identity to perform. Alan Watts often pointed to this moment indirectly. When the old sense of self dissolves, you are not yet anyone new. And the brain hates this. The mind is wired to seek familiarity, so when structure disappears, it tries to pull you back into the known. Back into old habits, old identities, old ways of defining yourself. Not because they're true, but because they're familiar. This is why chaos feels dangerous, not because something is wrong, but because control is gone. Here's the quiet truth most people never hear. Chaos doesn't need to be fixed. It doesn't need to be rushed through, and it definitely doesn't need to be medicated away with constant stimulation or forced meaning. Chaos needs to be stayed with, long enough for the nervous system to learn that it's safe without performance, safe without identity, safe without knowing exactly who you are yet. In the next part, we'll talk about the most common mistakes people make at this stage, the ways they escape the chaos too early and accidentally keep themselves stuck. Because the danger isn't in being lost. The danger is in trying to end the chaos before it's done doing its work. Most people don't get lost. They just panic too soon. Once chaos appears, most people don't actually sit with it. They try to escape it. Not because they're weak, but because the void is deeply uncomfortable. So the mind starts searching for exits. One of the most common ones is spiritual bypassing. This is when you use spiritual language to avoid emotional truth. You tell yourself things like everything happens for a reason, or I'm already beyond this, or the ego is just dying. The words sound elevated, but underneath them is fear you don't want to feel. Spiritual bypassing doesn't heal the void, it just covers it with concepts. Another trap is new identity addiction. When the old identity collapses, the mind wants a replacement. So it grabs onto a new label: healer, coach, awakened one, someone who's figured it out. This can look like growth, but often it's just a new costume, a way to feel special again. A way to feel certain again? But identity built too quickly is usually built on avoidance. Then there's productivity guilt. You feel like you should be doing something, building something, fixing something. So you try to optimize the void. You turn rest into a task, reflection into a checklist, healing into a project. But this phase isn't meant to be productive. It's meant to be integrative. Trying to force progress here is like trying to harvest fruit before the tree has finished rooting. And finally, there's comparing timelines. You look at others who seem clear, people who found their purpose, people who moved on faster, and quietly you conclude that you're behind. But what you're seeing is usually not depth, it's certainty. And certainty is often borrowed. All of these strategies have one thing in common. They reduce discomfort. They make the uncertainty easier to tolerate. But they also extend the confusion, because they prevent you from staying long enough for something honest to emerge. Here's the lesson that changes everything. The void is not a problem to be solved. It's not an emptiness to be filled. It's a space where false identities fall away, a space where borrowed meanings dissolve, a space where something truer can finally take form. If you rush to fill it, you don't eliminate the void, you just postpone it. In the next part, we'll talk about what happens when you stop trying to escape, how direction begins to return naturally, not as a role or an identity, but as a quiet sense of alignment, because the void doesn't exist to take something from you. It exists to make room for what was never able to appear before. Being lost is not failure, it's the space before authenticity. When you stop trying to escape the void, something quiet begins to change. Not all at once, not dramatically. Direction doesn't come back as a plan. It returns as a felt sense. You start listening to your body again, not in a mystical way, but in a practical, grounded one. You notice when something feels heavy, when a conversation drains you, when an obligation tightens your chest. And you notice the opposite too. Moments that feel light, simple, alive. You begin to trust those signals more than theories, frameworks, or advice. You choose less, but what you choose fits. There's less interest in proving anything, less urgency to explain yourself. You don't need an impressive story to justify your choices. You're no longer trying to sound evolved or appear meaningful. You're just trying to be honest. This is how direction actually forms, not through grand visions or 5-year plans, but through small, aligned movements. You simplify. Your actions might look smaller from the outside. Fewer commitments, fewer ambitions, less visible progress. But inside there's more energy, more coherence. You might start doing things that don't look important but feel right. Walking more. Creating without an audience. Saying no without over-explaining. These aren't signs of retreat. They're signs of alignment. A gentle question begins to guide you now. Not, what should I become? That question belongs to the old story, but something quieter. What feels honest right now? That question doesn't rush you. It doesn't demand an identity. It doesn't promise certainty. It simply keeps you oriented toward truth. And over time, that honesty compounds. What emerges isn't a persona. It isn't a role you perform. It's a way of being that doesn't require constant effort. This is the part no one can give you a formula for. Because authenticity isn't designed, it isn't optimized, it isn't chosen from options. It emerges when you stop trying to be someone. And if you stay long enough in this space, the space before answers, before certainty, before labels, you don't suddenly find yourself. You realize there was never anything missing. Only something waiting for you to stop forcing your way forward, so it could finally come through. Awakening doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like confusion. Because clarity is the product of a map, and awareness breaks the map. Clarity belongs to systems, roles, identities, to knowing where you're going because someone already drew the path. But awareness doesn't give you directions. It removes what no longer fits. So if you feel confused right now, it may not be because you're lost. It may be because you're no longer willing to pretend you know who you are. Maybe you don't have the words yet. Maybe you can't explain your direction. Maybe you don't have a story that sounds impressive. But something important has already happened. You might not know who you are becoming, but you know who you can no longer be. And that knowledge is quieter than certainty, but far more honest. This phase doesn't ask you to fix yourself. It asks you to stop forcing meaning where it hasn't formed yet, to let confusion exist without turning it into a problem. Because sometimes what feels like emptiness is actually space. Space for a different way of living, a different relationship with yourself, a different kind of direction, one that doesn't come from effort but from alignment. So maybe the question isn't, how do I figure myself out? Maybe it's something simpler. If you stop trying to figure yourself out, what might finally come through? And that's where we'll leave it. Not with answers, not with conclusions, just with the quiet understanding that being lost is not the opposite of awakening. It may be the most honest beginning of all.